Hello and welcome. This is your crash course to how substance abuse and domestic violence affects children and later on affects their adulthood. My name is Leah Adams. I am a licensed professional counselor and a certified clinical trauma specialist for individuals at Great Plains Youth and Family Services in Hobart, Oklahoma. And I'm making this video basically to give kind of an overview, very small overview of what these issues of, substance abuse and domestic violence, how they affect children. And I'll also go into what we know as into how they affect you as an adult. Start with statistics. In 2020, Oklahoma was 5th in the country for substance abuse disorders. We know trauma from abuse, domestic violence, and substance abuse by parents causes major issues in adulthood, partly because children are sponges and they learn by watching how their parents deal with issues. And oftentimes they mirror the same behaviors, not only as young children, but as they get into adolescence and their brain starts forming the, frontal lobe more, they end up kind of falling back on these coping skills. And so if there's a lot of negative coping skills in the home, like substance abuse or anger issues or hitting or, anything like that, oftentimes these kids either end up displaying those same issues or they end up getting into relationships that mirror that same situation. We know that half of young people with PTSDs develop substance abuse issues as adults. Substance abusing girls mostly have sexual abuse as children. Boys have physical abuse. By the age 16, kids seek safety, sometimes with bad kids, gangs, predators. A lot of times they're the ones that end up getting preyed on by the older people that are like, let's get you into things that you don't need to be into, because they're looking for that safety that they never got at home. Youth at risk, domestic violence, parental mental illness, substance abuse, divorce, moving a lot, homelessness, being on their own for hours at a time, older siblings abusing or older siblings also using drugs because these kids look up to them. And like I said, children up until the age of about 6, 7 are sponges. They just take in everything around them and the people that are influencing them. That's who they learn from. That's how they learn their behavior. And let me tell you, as a counselor, 99% of the kids that have anger issues in school are living in a home where there's somebody that has anger issues that gets away with it because they're an adult. And the kids are like, hey, if I do this and I slap somebody because they did something wrong, I'm just doing what my parent does and they get away with it. 75% have witnessed violence, have current alcohol use disorders. 52% have been physically assaulted. 16% have PTSD. Kids disassociate a lot around violence. So I hear sometimes from parents that, yes, all of this was going on in the home, but they didn't notice, or they were too young, or they don't react when mom and dad are beating each other up or doing drugs, or there's a lot of people in and out. The kid is zoned into a video game or reading or whatever. And it's not that they don't notice, they know how to disassociate, which means that when they get into school and they suddenly have that fight or flight response because something is going on in class, then they're going to end up disassociating in class also. And that's where you go to a lot of parent-teacher conferences where the teacher is saying, well, they zone out a lot. And it's not necessarily ADD, it's trauma. And one thing that trauma, as a specialization, with the ACE, which stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences, which is a inventory that we do now. It has kind of taught us that a lot of the mental health disorders that people are diagnosed with, either in childhood or definitely as an adult, they end up being trauma-based. And trauma is one of those things that stacks. So if you have a traumatic, childhood experience, either domestic violence, substance abuse, losing a parent, parents becoming incarcerated, whatever, then you have, like a bad experience at school where you're bullied, or teachers are bullying you, or you just don't fit in. Then you grow up and you end up, either taking a job that's a stressful situation, or getting into a bad, relationship. And then, it's all stacked on top of each other. And what we see is that once people's frontal lobe fully forms between 25, 28 years old, a lot of the coping skills that they end up falling back on are the ones that the people who raised them have. And so you hear a lot of people saying, I didn't want to be like this with my kids, but I find myself sounding exactly like my mom, or sounding exactly like my dad. And it's because what we learn in that first few years, where it's just, the parents, we mirror their behaviors. And even though that is going to change and become more fluid, once you hit, late adolescence and your frontal lobe is completely formed, then those coping skills are kind of like in the back of your mind, and they start coming to the surface. We know that also, as of 2020, they compared kids in the juvenile justice system that had PTSD to soldiers returning from Iraq that also had PTSD. And they found that 50% of kids in the juvenile justice system had it, and 20% of soldiers had it. So that's big. A lot of times with juvenile justice, what they're doing is they're trying to punish the kid because they think if they severely punish them, then they're going to change their behavior and become, productive adults. And a lot of times what's happening is these kids are getting into trouble, not only because they're seeking safety with the gangs, or, kids that are in trouble, but also because they don't have coping skills, because at home it is a war zone. And so they're just acting like their parents act. And so punishing them is just more of the same thing. It's more abuse. And it really doesn't work. And, that's what now trauma specialists are figuring out, that you can't just use cognitive behavior therapy, because you can't just tell them, okay, you need to stop and then rethink things. Because when you're in fight or flight, you don't have the frontal lobe ability to just stop and rethink. And a lot of the soldiers that were going through all kinds of different types of therapy and group therapy and everything like that, that's what it was based on, was cognitive behavioral therapy. And unfortunately, they would complete it, they would get their little successful, certification, but then they would go home, and a lot of times there were suicide either attempts, or, they would completely commit suicide. And it took the ACE finally coming about, that people were like, light on, we're realizing what's going on. We can't just tell them, you need to reframe how you're thinking. We need to deal with how to get out of fight or flight, and then you can use cognitive behavioral therapy. Because once you're in fight or flight, you're not thinking straight. You're in literally your, lizard brain. You're only reacting to the situation. You're not dealing with what's, going on rationally. And worse yet, when you have a lot of trauma as a child, you stay in your head all the time. Everything is a threat in the environment, because you're constantly scanning the environment to see what could be a threat. You're constantly overthinking. A lot of times people have major sleep disturbances because of what has happened, when they were children, and they're constantly rethinking their whole day. And, did I say this wrong? Did I do this wrong? And so, yes, they have anxiety disorders on top of the PTSD. And this last year, the ICD, which is one of the major tools that people use to diagnose, issues, diseases, whatever, they added complex PTSD, which is just based on trauma from your childhood causing issues as an adult. and we're just waiting for the DSM to, catch up. But you can have both. You can actually have complex PTSD and you can have PTSD. Regular PTSD has flashbacks to an actual event. So when you're thinking of soldiers, something got blown up or someone got killed, or somebody who's in the police force, or first responders, that's that PTSD because it's a flashback to an actual event. The flashbacks with complex PTSD are more emotional. You just suddenly have this fear, you suddenly have something, and you can't really put your finger on it. It's just you're suddenly afraid, and it could be a smell, it could be somebody looks at you wrong, it just could be the feeling, when you feel somebody come into the room and they're angry and they don't even have to say anything, they don't even have to have it on their face, you can feel that radiating. And that goes back to children, because babies, when they're conceived up until 7, 8 years old, that's how they feel out a room, is they know who's going to be angry and they know who's sad or whatever, because they feel those emotions coming off of those people, those caregivers. And so as an adult, you're suddenly very empathetic to everything going on around you, and it's maybe a good thing or maybe a bad thing depending on how you react. Substance abuse also creates issues of the absent parent. And I don't necessarily mean physically, it could be emotionally. They could just be checked out because they're drugged out, or it could be physically, to where they're just not there. And a lot of times what happens is they get friends that will watch their kids, and these friends a lot of times are predators, because predators will flat out tell you, yeah, I love substance abusing parents, because they'll give me access to their kid and they won't think twice about it, because they need somebody to watch their kid while they go get messed up. Or I'll even give them drugs, they'll be messed up in the other room and I've got access to their kids. And I've also had parents that, because they're on drugs, will do things to their kids that they would not normally do, and they would not think in a million years that they would ever be that person. But drugs affect your brain. You don't make good decisions. You're constantly in that toddler brain where just, I'm going to do it because it feels good. And you don't think, hitting my kid with something that could kill them, or sexually abusing my kid, you don't think, oh, this is a bad thing, because you're not thinking straight. And a lot of times that's what we see with parents that have been, in trouble for sexual abuse or extreme physical abuse, is that they were messed up on drugs at the time. And there's no pass, but also what we see is that these parents were raised by people that were doing the same thing. And so because they didn't get the help they needed when they were raising their kid or before they had children, they end up repeating the same pattern. And we see a lot of generational trauma. So you also get adultized children. And I see this so much, where it's not necessarily the oldest kid. Sometimes the oldest kid is completely checked out, or they're also being substance abusers. Sometimes it's the youngest kid. Sometimes it's the middle kid. I've had, toddlers that get up in the morning and make breakfast for their other siblings. And of course they can't reach the counter. So they dig in the trash and, feed everybody. And it's horrible. And these kids have no choice but to be adultized, because if they don't adultize themselves, they don't survive. And unfortunately, that survival instinct carries on when they're in foster care and they have some problems. They end up hoarding food, or hiding it, or overeating, or, whatever. And it's very much a trauma response to not having that nurturing, caring parent take care of them when they needed it the most. And babies and toddlers, you have to take care of them. They cannot take care of themselves fully. They can survive, sometimes, you know, but it just creates some really bad coping skills that carry into adulthood. So family roles, because you have to talk about family roles if you're talking about how substance abuse and domestic violence affects children. You get the hero, who is the kid that is very parentified. You know, not only do they take care of everybody, but they always feel they have to be perfect. And they, you know, you see them having this massive perfectionistic trait. And that's when they melt down at school or in sports or in the home or whatever, is when something isn't perfect. And they're very hard on themselves. I mean, even, you know, you're going to miss a question in school. It's going to happen. But the minute it happens, that's when they go into fight or flight, because they feel that if they don't do something perfect, there's going to be consequences. They also feel like they need to protect the parents, you know, protect their reputation. They often won't talk about what's going on at home, or they won't acknowledge that everybody knows that mom and dad got arrested for drugs or that they were in foster care or whatever. It's just like, no, you know, it's not their fault. And it makes it difficult because a lot of times people in DHS or the police departments, you know, they're like, well, I don't understand. This kid is just not, you know, they're not in reality. And it's, of course not. This is a protective thing for them. You know, it's a fear response, you know, and you shouldn't be expecting a child to want to give you all this information just because you need it to, you know, rat out the adults, you know, because it's too much pressure on the child because they have their role and they're very particular about that role. The role makes the family work. These hero children often grow up and end up having steady jobs, good jobs, careers, whatever. But oftentimes they're the ones who were the prescription drug addicts. And when the opioids were flowing so freely in the last 20 years, they were the ones who oftentimes were dying from them, because it's okay because it's from a doctor. But they were abusing them because they were still using the same coping skills that the parents were using. Then you have the clown. They try to make everyone laugh. They try to make everyone happy. And oftentimes it's almost a desperate attempt to make everyone happy. You know, when they're in fight or flight, they're trying to appease everyone. They're trying to make everyone laugh. And so you think about a classroom situation where, you know, there's a bunch of kids, especially when you hit junior high, you know, that ego starts kicking in and you start worrying about how people think about you. And, you know, something triggers you, something makes you nervous, the teacher's like, okay, everybody's going to read aloud, which is horrible. And suddenly you're the one over there making jokes and you're in trouble. You're sitting out in the hall or you're sitting at the principal or whatever. It's your fear response. It's what you've been, you know, that's your survival skill. And yeah, there's other ways to deal with it other than just get out, punish you, whatever. But everybody has to be on the same page when it comes to trauma and how to deal with these things. The scapegoat is the kid that is blamed for everything. And I have literally had parents that came in and said, you know, this 4-year-old kid is the root of all of our problems. And it's like, he's 4, you know, but everybody hates this kid. And the kid ends up filled with such self-hatred that, you know, not only are they more likely to become addicts, they're also more likely nowadays to end up committing suicide, because, you know, suicide has been hugely on the rise, especially definitely in the last 10 years, but especially in the last 3 years. You know, it's real hard to go through life if you hate yourself and that you feel like you're to blame for every single thing that's gone on in your family. Or, you know, you'll usually find a spouse that treats you like crap because that's what you think that you deserve. You have the caretaker, which is the adultized kid. They're the enabler. They also step in to take the consequences for another child. They're the ones who feel like that if they don't take care of everyone, and I mean, they're literally taking care of them, helping mom to bed when she's too drunk, and they're 6, or getting everybody up in the morning or whatever. They're the ones that are like, I'm going to stick up for my little brother, because even though he was throwing rocks through the window, as soon as the person comes and says, well, you're going to need to pay for this, they intervene and they start like a fight or whatever, because they don't want anybody to deal with consequences. It literally stresses them out as soon as there's any kind of conflict. And so these kids have huge anxiety disorders because they're trying to keep everybody taken care of. And what happens is when they get older and they start getting into relationships, they end up getting into relationships with alcoholics or addicts because they are the caretaker, they're the enabler. And so even though they don't want to be in that situation, they gravitate towards it. And alcoholics and addicts gravitate towards them because they are looking for enablers, because you can't be a functional alcoholic or addict if you don't have people to enable you. You just can't. Then there's the lost child. They blend in and shut down. They're there, but they're not there. They could be in the room. They're the ones that nobody ever talks about. They're part of the family, but nobody ever acknowledges them. They're the fly on the wall, and they get very lost in that. And they're the ones that are usually like, well, I'm a huge, introvert. And sometimes they end up living at home till they're 50 years old. They end up not getting into relationships. They don't know how to socialize because they were just ignored. Then you have the primary, is the main person with the substance abuse issue, the domestic violence issue. And, I haven't mentioned the domestic violence as much, but it's the same thing. Whoever is the person who's angry and willing to hurt people physically, emotionally, sexually, or psychologically to get their way, everybody is dancing around them. It's like walking on eggshells all the time, trying to keep the person in the middle of the tornado happy. And a lot of times they get so these people that are doing the substances or doing, the angry outbursts and everything like that, they don't want to do that. They just don't feel like they have any control, because as soon as they get triggered, they lose it. And part of that is not getting that help to figure out, okay, what triggers me and how am I going to figure something different instead of just punching a wall or punching my spouse or whatever. And so what you get are, kids that grow up in trauma, that become adults, that get into a relationship, and pretty soon they are violating their own values. And by that, I mean, I want to be different. I don't want to be like my parents. I want to be a good parent. I don't want to scream at them. I don't want to hit them. I don't want to deny them food. All of the things that you go through as a kid. And then pretty soon, that's your coping mechanism. You immediately spank them when they do something wrong. And it's like, okay, I just hit my child. It doesn't matter if it's on the bottom. I hit them, but I'm telling them, you can't hit another kid when they don't do what you want, but I'm going to hit you when you don't do what I want, and it's like, and that violates your value system, because pretty soon you're triggered, you're doing that, you're hitting a wall, you're hitting your spouse, whatever. And then you feel guilty because you're like, I didn't want to be like this. And then it becomes this really messy cycle of guilt leading to shame, leading to being triggered, leading to doing it again. And it's the same cycle that people that end up using substances, end up doing. I didn't want to be an addict, but my mom was an addict all her life. And so somebody offers me drugs, I'm at a low, I go ahead and try them. Hey, I feel great. And then suddenly you're addicted. And it doesn't matter what the substance is. It could be nicotine. Nicotine's highly addictive, And if you've ever tried to stop smoking, you know you become a monster for the first couple of weeks. And even your brain is like, go ahead, who cares? Might as well go ahead and smoke. The world's ending anyways, might as well smoke. It's the same thing. So I mentioned the ACE, the Adverse Childhood Experience. It is a 10-question inventory, and I gave you a copy of that that you can take. I also gave you a copy of the 10-question inventory that you would take for your child. Like, what do you think they've experienced type thing. And it's 10 questions. It's super easy. You wouldn't think that that would be so, dramatic, that it would cause all these issues as an adult, but it is. We know that if you score a 6 or higher, that you're going to lose 20 years of your life if you do not find better coping skills and find ways to stop being triggered. It's a neurological response. You can't just say you need to stop that, because it's not going to work. It is a neurological response. It is literally fight or flight. If somebody threw a rattlesnake at you, most people are not just going to be like, yep, it's a rattlesnake. Most people are going to react. They're going to go into fight or flight. It's there for a reason. But it also causes this massive cortisol dump, and cortisol is very damaging to your body. You see people with cancer, you see people with, autoimmune issues, you see every type of inflammation in the body. 4 or higher, you get your basic illnesses, the IBS. That's a big one, because if you don't know this, anxiety starts in your stomach. So if you've got an anxiety issue, you've got the tummy pills, the acid reflux, GERD, IBS-D, IBS-C, I just don't know what's going to affect my stomach, so I just try to eat. That's where it starts. And you can have lost jobs, from the 4 or higher. You can definitely have substance abuse, because people just repeat those patterns. Homelessness, definitely lost relationships, because you're using those same coping mechanisms that you learned as a kid. And there's a reason why people that have parents that get divorced end up getting into relationships where they get divorced. It's not just a pattern thing, it's coping mechanisms. There's a reason why you get generational incarceration, because trauma is generational. We know this without a doubt. We know that a lot of the massive trauma, at least for the United States, started when TVs came into the home, which was about the same time, right after World War II. So suddenly your little neighborhood view of the world became very worldly. And what do they talk about on the news? It's always the negative, and so suddenly people were exposed to the after effects of, the Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and suddenly schools were doing the bomb scares. During the 50s, it was like somebody has dropped a big bomb, and so we're going to get under our desk and hope that the radiation and everything doesn't kill us, which it is what it is. Now it's actual bomb scares and everything like that in schools. So we've gone from, I'd say, the 80s, where we didn't do a lot of that. We did fire drills and tornado drills in Oklahoma. Now we're, intruder drills and bomb drills and shooter. I mean, it's ridiculous, and it is scary, and it does cause trauma, but it also saves lives because they know what to do. So it's kind of a, balancing thing. But as far as the generational trauma, the adults that could not find good coping skills, that were suddenly very terrified because they were coming off of World War II and, all of the stuff that you see on the media, you had a lot of parents that were suddenly drinking a lot and smoking a lot. I mean, look at, when cigarettes really came to their height and stuff. You had other drugs being, a big deal. I mean, there was a reason why movies like Reefer Madness and stuff like that were being put out, and then you go into another generation where the 60s, it's very tumultuous and people are trying to fight, these different situations and equal rights and, race wars and, all of that stuff really came to a head. And so people started being afraid of everything, and, 70s, 80s, every generation has had their big deal. And we did have some peace there for a while. I mean, we didn't have a war in the 80s. It was amazing. Not here, that we were actually like, we're in a war. And then the 90s hit, Desert Storm, Desert Shield, all of that, and goes right into the Twin Towers, and so it's just been boom, boom, boom. And that's on a global scale. Imagine what's happening with these families individually, because drugs have become just ridiculously out of control in Oklahoma. It is the coping skill, alcoholism. And I'd say COVID is going to be one of those huge catastrophic events, because after COVID, we have seen a huge rise in alcoholism and, substance abuse, massive domestic violence, massive child abuse, homicide. It's not just, I'm going to beat up my family. I'm going to kill my family, and it's ridiculous, but it's because everyone was so afraid of this invisible thing and losing jobs and losing money and everything like that, that it became another catastrophe for generational trauma. And, you see a lot of these buzzwords, break the cycle. And this is what we're talking about. If you're going to break the cycle so that you don't repeat those same patterns and instill that into your children to where they keep repeating those same patterns, and it is getting worse with each generation, then you've got to find some better coping skills. You've got to find and mirror the breathing technique, where you stop and you take a deep breath in through your nose for 5 seconds and you hold it, and then you let it out for 6 seconds, or the box method, which is the same thing. Breathe in, hold, breathe out, hold, whatever you have to visualize. There are 2 very good types of therapy that help with this. EMDR is one, and there is a certified EMDR therapist in Altus. Seeking Safety is another, and we will be doing that group soon, just not sure when. EMDR deals with kind of undoing those connections of the trauma that you experienced prior to now. Seeking Safety is about now, like, what kind of coping skills are going to work for me now? Yes, I've had this stuff in the past. How is it affecting me now? It's all about the now. And sometimes it works a little better because people are afraid, well, if I go into counseling, I'm going to have to talk about everything, and I don't want to do that. And you're going to anyways. It is what it is, but you don't have to. And breaking those cycles means also setting that example of, yes, I know I've got an issue, I'm going to go get help. And because I'm getting help and my child knows that I'm getting help, they know that if they have issues, they can get help, and that it's okay. It's no longer a stigma. It's not a big deal. And if they start breaking down all of these diagnoses to trauma and no trauma, then you're going to see a lot less of a mental health stigma, because it's not going to be like, well, I've got anxiety and I've got ADD and I've got PTSD and I've got CPTSD and I've got depression. It's not like you've got 5 or 6 different types of diagnoses. It's just going to be one. It's like, well, you've got complex, PTSD from the trauma, and we're going to deal with that. And all of these other things that look like a diagnosis, that's just your coping skills. That's your coping mechanism. And so let's try to change those, So you've got your handouts. It also includes the ACE. And there's just some extra stuff. That's all for you to look at after group, whenever, take a break, look at it tomorrow, look at it next week, whatever. Give yourself time to absorb all of this information because it's a lot. And then kind of, see, okay, where am I at? You've got a list of coping skills there that you can try one each week. Like, okay, this didn't work. The breathing technique didn't work. I couldn't think about breathing when I was triggered. So let's try something else. And it's not all gloom and doom. It's not like, oh, I have these bad coping skills, I'm never going to change, or I have the substance abuse issue, I'm never going to change. It's really not about that. I mean, we've thought about, it can't be like it was to where, well, I'll just go to a 30-day rehab and everything will be fixed. No, it doesn't work like that. But it does have to do with your resilience. And a lot of times when I give the ACE to kids and, talk about, okay, what have you experienced, these 10 things, I also give the resilience scale to find out where they're at. Because just because you've got a 9 or a 10 on the ACE doesn't mean you're destined to lose that 20 years of life. It doesn't mean you're destined to be sick. It doesn't mean you're destined to ever try substances, or beat up your spouse or anything like that, because your resilience is that balance. And oftentimes what we see is if you have one person in your life as a child that you can trust, that you can go to, doesn't have to be in the family. It could be a teacher, it could be somebody in the community, it could be a youth minister, it could be just anyone, it could be an aunt, uncle, whatever. Someone that loves you completely, that wants to nurture you, that is like, hey, I am there for you. Even if I'm not there for you physically, that you could always call me, that I am always going to be there. I'm not going to sit there and yell at you because you're having this emotional response. I'm going to be a nurturing, validating friend. Sometimes that's all it takes, and that's really all parenting takes, is nurture and validate. Don't tell the kid, you're not really angry, you're not really scared. Go in there and, deal with the monster under the bed, or I'm gonna, beat your butt or whatever. You can't do that. Children cannot self, calm themselves down. They need the parent to be calm and mirror that. Babies especially cannot self-soothe. You have to pick them up. You can't let them cry it out, even though that was the method. No, anxiety, and especially if you were anxious when you were carrying them, because we know conception to now, it's not, oh, well, they were born here and, what have they experienced here? No, it's what have they experienced in the womb. 100% of the substances that you did went to them. 100% of the stress goes to them, and they're forming brains. This is a big deal, but it doesn't mean it can't be fixed. It's just something that you have to work on. And hopefully, you can find those resources. And even if you can't find the resources outside in the community, there are tons of online resources. Just look into the ACE. There are websites all over the place. There's free groups online. There's some free therapy online. So if you have any questions, you can talk to your facilitator, and she can either get a hold of me or she might be able to answer them. But have a good day and try to absorb some of the stuff. And like I said, try to definitely take one coping skill off that list and try it out and see if it works. Because if it works, you're going to feel 100% better. Thank you and have a good day.